So let's talk a little bit about naming conventions for database tables and fields. Ultimately, you can do whatever you want in terms of naming tables and fields, but our recommendation is always that you should try to be as consistent as possible across your database. So consistently name something. And that will ultimately, like naming in general, will make it easier for other developers or others working on your database. It makes it easier for them to understand the data that they're working with and thus being able to work with your data more effectively. So here's a little checklist for table naming. So here we have a list which will hopefully help you identify and create consistent names throughout your database. So make sure that your table name is unique. So generally, each table will have a unique name. Try and make it meaningful and descriptive, so it's easy for anyone to be able to look at the table name and to identify potentially the data within. Now, this isn't always going to be best practice, of course, because you may wish to change the name to something a little bit obscure. And that way you're maybe adding a layer of security, because it makes it harder potentially for someone who may be infiltrating your database to understand what data it is that they're trying to look for. If you were just to make a table called person or employee, well, it makes it a lot easier just to get to that table and you know exactly what's inside of it. Like everything, there's always a positive and negative, a benefit and drawback. So again, these are just guidelines. So make sure that your table name identifies the subject or entity. That can be a good thing. Minimum number of words possible. Avoid any acronyms or abbreviations in some cases. Now, what you can do here with this list in actual fact, because potentially there's two steps here. There's the designing of a database, whereby we develop the tables and fields. So at that stage, you might decide to use clear, understandable, identifiable words, but eventually that's going to need to be applied into the database, and at that point it becomes the domain of the database administrator and the developers, and they may have a different scheme for naming which is appropriate for their application development process. So you could think of this in two steps as well. So maybe this is more towards the idea of initially designing the database, thinking about these guidelines. Here is the table set that we've created so far throughout this process. We have 6 tables now. So this is the initial naming scheme as well applied. So we can utilize these guidelines as well as the principles that we are identifying in this section or this tutorial. And then we'll go ahead and apply that to our table set here, our preliminary set of tables. So there are some other factors to consider, and this potentially, again, is splitting up the process here in terms of a design step and then the implementation step, because naming isn't just about thinking about what name we want to use. We also maybe need to consider the technologies that we're using, how we're going to implement or where we're going to implement our actual tables. So here, for example, is just an extract from the PostgreSQL documentation in regards to the naming convention. So you might find that some technologies, there may be restrictions or there may be guidelines in terms of how to actually present or to generate names for tables in that particular technology. So it's just a little heads up in some respects. Just if you know what database you're going to be utilizing, maybe just check the documentation and the naming convention for that database. There are some different variables here. If you are working in Python for web, or if you're working with the Django framework, things are going to be slightly different here again, because here in Django, we create tables from a Django model. A Django model is a class, so therefore, in terms of actually naming our table, we need to follow class naming conventions because we're building a class, and Django would take that class name and utilize that as well as the app name to generate the actual table. So again, that's something to consider, and that potentially again is an example of this idea that when we design the table, we use naming, which is potentially going to be slightly different from when we actually apply or implement that. In this case, in a Django environment, Django will already have a system for naming tables. So in some respects, that does in terms of a Django environment, it already answers questions such as, should I use a space between names or should I use underscore? Well, the answer to that in the Django environment is that you're building a class, so you need to follow the class conventions. Typically, a space isn't allowed. So that answers that question. And the second question maybe you might have is, well, what do we do when we have names such as product name? Oh, sorry. What should we do, for example, in terms of naming our fields? Should we use the name of the subject here within the field or not? In this example, we can see that the field names have a prefix of the name of the table. Now, there are many different ways of working here. So, for example, what we could do is that we could remove the name product or the name of the actual object or entity and just go with the actual descriptor, so name, description, type, name, property name, etc. So that's one approach. You could, for example, create some sort of abbreviation. That's the word I was thinking of. So here you can see we're using prod underscore name, prod description, and so on. So that's a different approach. So here what we've done is we have removed everything, or the prefix here. So this is our updated tables fields. Now here in Django it works slightly different. If you were, for example, working with SQL, this type of approach might be fairly useful. And the reason why that is when you're generating SQL statements, for example, you would describe or identify name. And sometimes it's not always clear what name are you talking about. If you've got tables that have a field name in multiple tables, it can be hard to actually read through some of the SQL statements. So having this type of prefix here, where we have product, and you can see here we've kind of abbreviated that can be fairly useful in the name in some circumstances. Now here in Django, we don't tend to have that issue when we're generating queries, because we utilize the API query set API in Django. So that isn't necessarily a massive problem. So generally you'll just see the field names without any prefix, just the actual descriptor here, in this case name, description, and so on. So this is our current up-to-date table list, fields and tables for what we are developing in this application. It's also worth mentioning that in Django we are building our tables as classes, don't forget, and then our fields are going to be defined as variables. So we do need to follow the Python conventions for generating variables and variable names. If you're unsure of what those are, then by all means check out PEP8. So go to Google, type in PEP8 Python naming conventions, and you'll be able to read through some of the recommended naming conventions for variables.